Okay, chapter 2, worth doing again, because these chapters are rich and complex, and I'm not sure what they're going to ask us in the exams. Okay. What is cognitive neuroscience and why is it important? How are things in the environment, such as faces, represented in the brain? To what extent are functions localized in the brain? And how can we go beyond simply correlating cognitive functions with certain brain regions? Cognitive neuroscience is the study of the physiological basis of cognition and involves an understanding both of the nervous system and the individual units that comprise that system. Okay, so neurons are made up of the nervous system is made of neurons, which are the building blocks of the nervous system. They create, receive, transmit information in the nervous system. Each and every neuron has a cell body like any other cell, an axon, and dendrites. Okay, before people knew about neurons, they thought there was a network of nervous sorry, God. Sorry. I have to edit that out. They thought there was a nerve net. Well, they did think they were neurons, but they thought that they formed a net. Okay, so that everything is interconnected. And so that means also that if one piece is missing, the rest of the network can compensate for it. So it's holistic and synthetic, synthesizes everything by being interconnected. But it turns out that this isn't so because it's more linear than that. For example, the sciatic nerve is one long nerve that runs from the lower spine right down the leg and into the foot. That is a single neuron. And if it is broken, there's a gross loss of function. Okay, so let's look at the dendrites are the receivers and the axon is the transmitter. So you go axon, cell body, dendrites, or dendrites, cell body, axon. Okay, so here's your nerve cell. It's got a resting potential. An action potential means that that nerve then fires. An electrical signal then travels along the axon and arrives at the dendrites of another neuron. Okay, that action potential's voltage stays the same. It doesn't change. And you can measure that. So how does the neuron transmit intensity? It doesn't change the electrical power of that signal, but it does send them up more frequently. So the rate of sending of signals goes up in order to measure intensity. That's speed, okay? Right, so here you have your axon and here you have your dendrites. Between there and there, there's a gap. It's called a synapse. So what happens is that the cell here of the axon, cell membrane, releases, there's little vesicles, meaning little pockets within the cell that hold chemicals, neurochemicals. Those pockets open and those vesicles release those neurochemicals, which then travel off to the dendrites, hit the cell, and are either absorbed or bounce back. Okay? And that tells the dendrites what signal to send along electrically. So it goes electrical, chemical, electrical. Neural representation. Okay, so what happens is that our nervous system creates representations so that we can think. In other words, when you imagine a brown square chair with a yellow cushion that's on fire while traveling on the back of a horse down the highway in space, each of those aspects is represented by a particular part of the brain, which is fascinating, right? Okay, now we get very creepy experiments that prove that this is true. So you get the psychopathic, most likely, Hubel and Weissel from the 1960s, who did terrible things to cats. Okay, and they proved that there are specific neurons that respond to a specific stimulus. So switch off your empathy and get scientific for a moment. Okay, so they immobilize the cat. They make sure that the visual field is locked down. They've got an electrode in the brain, fortunately partially anesthetized, so they can see which parts of the brain are firing. They show that eyeball an orientated bar, an orientated moving bar, and a short moving bar. So they can isolate what feature is being recorded by what part of the brain. Okay. Then they did more horrible things to kittens over time. And they proved that the brain is plastic. In other words, if you restrict the input, the brain then gets stuck like that and cannot process a larger sensory field. So a gentler example is like children who have been raised from infancy by animals. Parts of their brain are very developed because, you know, to fit in with the animals and to survive that way. And other parts are terribly underdeveloped because they've never been stimulated. And that is a much sweeter way of showing the same thing, that the brain is plastic. Okay, is by looking at natural history. Okay, what also is true about how those structural information processes happen within the brain is that there's a hierarchical sequence. Remember the computer model where it goes general information filter, detection, and then memory. So you could say here it goes from simple to complex. So the bottom part of the hierarchy processes the gross information like orange, round, shiny. The higher part of the brain, so that might happen somewhere further back in the brain, further lower in the brain, further inward in the brain. Then the cortex will go plastic ball from the toy shop. And that would be somewhere much closer to the cortex, much closer to the frontal lobes. Okay, I wonder where she got it from. I wonder what she's doing with it in her house, okay? Frontal lobe. All right. Now there's three types of coding: specificity, population, and sparse. So specific means single, population means large group, and sparse means only a few. Okay. So for example, there may be a single neuron that processes very important information about the face, like gender, perhaps. I'm just giving you an example, I don't know. Then you get population where a whole batch of neurons are all firing together to say, oh, there is Mary. I know all about Mary. Then you get sparse coding, where maybe only 3 or 4 neurons are talking. Okay, this is whatever his name is, Raphael. Okay, and they're recognizing him that way. So there are 3 kinds of sensory coding. What are there again? Specificity coding, population coding, and sparse coding. Let's talk about localization of function. Localization of function means that specific functions are served by specific parts of the brain. And the Nazi cat experiments prove undeniably that this is true. Did you know the cerebral cortex is only 3 millimeters thick? And that's us, that's you know, that's the cerebral cortex. So the part of the brain that makes us us is only 3 millimeters thick. This huge organ in this big skull. Fascinating and strange. Okay, so let's look at localization function with looking at language in particular. Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Broca's is where language production happens, and Wernicke's area is where comprehension happens. So if you look at this picture, you can see that that fissure there separates the frontal and the temporal. So there's your temporal, where you've got Wernicke's for listening, for input of language. Then you've got Broca's in the frontal for production. Now here's personal. I had a grandmother, and she had a major stroke, and it knocked out the Broca's area completely. She could comprehend anything someone said to her, but she could not, either verbally, in writing, symbolically, or gesturally, communicate. In other words, the part of her brain that generated the ability to convey information symbolically through a language of any kind whatsoever was knocked out. And yet she understood everything. She lived with that profound disability for 10 years. And it never changed. Once it was out, it was out. So, Broca's, production, Wernicke's, input, comprehension. Okay, so breaking down localization function, do you remember which part of the brain is connected with vision? So here's your eyes, here's your occipital at the back. So it's like goes straight through the head. It doesn't really, but easier to remember. Parietal up here, touch, temperature, and pain. Temporal, hearing, taste, and smell. Temporal. Coordination of information and higher reasoning and decision-making. Frontal. Localization of function. Okay, we know that function is localized. For example, Broca and Wernicke's parts of the brain for different functions relating to language. Okay, they use functional MRIs to measure this with oxygenated blood cells, red blood cells, hemoglobin molecules within the red blood cells, okay? If it's oxygenated, it fires differently in the MRI to when it's not oxygenated because they have different magnetic qualities according to the level of oxygen in those cells, okay? There's different parts of the body again. We're not going to go into this. Skip that. Distributed representation in the brain. Now, most of our experience is multidimensional and uses bits of the brain from all over because remember, there's a specific part of the brain that's going to process green, and there's a specific part of the brain that's going to process round, and there's a specific part of the brain that will process solid, shiny, moving towards you, in conjunction with other objects in a particular shape or configuration, all of that. Each of those qualities is specific to part of the brain. So when you're looking at this, how much of your brain is firing? A massive amount of it. Okay, so it complements, it's both specific and it's a neural network. Okay, a neural network meaning the whole brain is a network that communicates one with the other because you've got to put it all together to create a coherent picture of what's going on out there. Structurally connected, it is a physical thing and it's unique to each of us depending, because the brain is plastic, on what you've been exposed to. When you learn new things, the actual physical shape of your brain changes. That's structural connectivity, okay? Functional connectivity means there's a sequence, there's a cascade of events and communication that happens over time as you think and cognate. cognitively process. Okay, we measure that with an EEG because that's good for measuring things over time. Okay, and that is chapter 2 again, done. See you now for chapter 3. Good luck. And don't forget, I need a microphone. Subscribe.